Started. Thank you all for coming. Weather held out beautifully, which is nice. I think most of you probably know John Flanagan. He's the Vice President of the Millbrook Historical Society. He's lived here for almost 80 years?
81
years. All right, I was wrong. So he, for a long time, was the administrator of the cemetery, and the Quaker Meeting House is part of that. And so he's going to give a little talk. We'll start out here. We'll then explore inside, and plenty of time for questions. We have cookies and brownies afterward if people are interested. All right, I'll turn it over to John.
Okay, welcome everybody. This building you're going to see is exactly as it was in 1780. That's when they built this. And prior to that, 10, 15 years before, once or twice, two other wooden buildings burned down. But this was built and opened in 1780, and everything in there is, if you walk in there and you walk in 1780, you would see the same thing that we're going to show you. Now, over where these cars are parked, there's a lot of Quakers buried over there. But they buried them with no markers. That was the Quakers, were very simple people. No markers. Later they used just a little piece of slate with nothing on it. And then even later they had a few slate stones where they scraped something into it. But you can't read it because it's so many years, that many years ago. But the bricks for this building all came from and they were brought down here, and they had no idea what they were doing. They were members of the Quakers, and they started doing the work. Well, it wound up costing twice what they thought it was gonna, because they had no experience doing this kind of thing. Now, as you're standing here looking, these windows all the way around, there's 544 windows. And over the years, periodically, Mrs. Perkins here in Millbrook would have them painted, and stucco painted, and anything else painted. And it finally got to the point a couple years ago, just before she died, that they couldn't do it anymore. And she got a company to come in here for weeks. They took every piece of putty out of every window in this building. They had to cut it all out, sand it, and go back and do the whole thing from, put some paint in there first, then put the windows in. And you're going to see a lot of windows here have curls in them. They were hand forged. And little by little over the years, through whether birds hit them or limbs hit them, they've gotten fewer and fewer. And when we got to put in new ones, we've got to put in just clear glass. And they're not as strong as these. I noticed today there's like 6 cracked windows, but none of them, luckily, are the hand-blown things. So, and one thing in here, everything that's in here came from within a couple miles of here. You're going to see pillars in there a foot, foot and a half square. You're going to see floors that are immaculate, and the only reason that they have stayed that way is because when they built this in 1780, they built, and you'll see it on the sides of the building, they built 2 slots on each side so the air could go underneath the building. And otherwise, there's never been electricity in this building, and there's never been plumbing in here. It wasn't made for that. And a couple of years ago, I had a woman from Clinton Corners call me up and said, we'd like to come and see the Quaker Meeting House. And I have a couple men that are writing the history of the Quakers all over the country. Well, they got here, they loved it. They thought it was great. And they were here for hours and hours, took a picture from every angle, up, down, inside, outside. And one of our officials on the cemetery here has been talking for a couple of years about putting in and this woman went bananas. No, that's what those vents are for. And that's why these cedar floors have held up. Because they always had air going under them and no water on top. So anyway, I would say 1,200. You'll see it when you get in. Yeah. Yeah, they're like 34 inches.
I had to keep those out of my house, so imagine how many are here. And the mice are starting.
Anybody doesn't have one, it's come up here. Now these floors are all cedar, and you can see they have square nails. That's what they used in those days. And these were cut from trees up the road a ways, the same as these big pillars were. These benches are as solid as they were in 1780. And over the last few years, I've had people come to me and say, hey, I want to buy a couple of those benches. I said, you can't do that. And they said, you just tell me what you want, and you can put it in your pocket. I said, you don't sell history. Yeah, I've had several times that people ask wanting to buy these seats. So on both sides of the building, there's these cast iron stoves, one here, and there's one in the other section down here. I opened the one door down there, and this one is the same, so I just wanted to get light down there and some air. But it's a 4 or 5 foot drop out those doors. And back in the old days, 1780s, 1800s, they drove in here with a cart and a wagon. And they would pull up there, and the wife and kids would get out and step right into here. So, but as you can see, being Quaker, no pictures, no writing, not a thing. They were very, very plain people. Let me see. When they built this in 1780, this was the largest Quaker meeting house in the Hudson Valley. To this day, it still is. And many, I've been to a couple up in Clinton, the town of Clinton and Hyde Park. They don't even compare to this building. They've done work to it, they've modified it and everything. This is the way it was in 1780. So, if anybody, we want to walk down this way, this is a much bigger...
I have a question.
Yeah, sure.
Go ahead. I understand that they had a co-educational school system.
Right.
So how did this building fit into that system?
When we get here, right here is a petition, right here. And when you get in this room, looking back this way, there's big petitions. The women would stay with the children on this side. They were not allowed to take part in the meetings. They would drop those down, and the women and children would stay in this side. And in that side,
All the men.
all the men were. And upstairs here is a balcony, and the balcony alone holds, I estimate, over 500 people.
What? So the school was here? The school was
Now,
here?
can I add something? The school, this is not the, this was always for worship. This is the building for worship, it wasn't the school. And this is a quarterly meeting house. Do you mind if I do this, John? Give a little...
No, that's all right.
The way the Quakers function, and it's not all past tense, they still exist. The way the Quakers function is that there's a meeting house, small meeting houses that are the weekly gathering places for Quakers. And you can walk to them in your neighborhood, in your community. And then there's a monthly meeting house, which is somewhat larger, and people from surrounding towns will gather. And then there's a quarterly meeting house, which this has been, that's why it's so large. And so people from all over the Hudson Valley, not just Poughkeepsie or Dutchess County, but from all over the Hudson Valley would gather here. And they still do that in a manner of speaking, although the Quakers have diminished in such population that there is an active meeting house at Bull's Head, and people meet there. I've been there, I've worshipped here. There's still worship here on Sunday mornings in the summer, and which is attended by about 5 people. So, but it's on that side that we gather. And,
The Oakwood Quaker School that's right near the IBM plant, Poughkeepsie, they still come out here periodically, but that's the sign out there. It says worshiping on Sundays 9 to 3 in good weather, but they're down to sometimes 2 people come, sometimes 4, sometimes 6. A couple times they had 10, was a big surprise, but they came from Oakwood School, and they had an elder sitting in here, and they were all sitting in a bench, and the elder was talking about, he went person by person. I had no idea what was going to happen, and I'm sitting on the bench over there like this and that, and nobody says a word for 10 minutes, and a woman stands up and said, I had a wonderful ride up here today from Westchester County, and the sun was shining, and I saw all God's trees and leaves and so on, and sat down. Nothing happened again for 15 or 20 minutes.
How long is the meeting?
Until they get done.
it's usually an hour. It's usually held for an hour.
Well, this went on, and this elder was over there, and then a guy stood up and talked about how fortunate he'd been in life and how good God had been to him. And it went on and on. And I thought, well, please let my phone ring. So I could go. But I stayed through the whole thing. It was interesting. But,
John, can I add about the school?
do what?
Can I add about the school?
Yeah.
And so just to kind of follow up on what you were saying, that this was a quarterly meeting house, there's also the yearly meeting,
Yeah.
which would take place. And so the regional kind of yearly meeting for this area was all the way down in Flushing and New Rochelle. And so in the late 18th century, like, you know, John said, this building opened in 1780. You guys know what was going on in 1780. It was in the midst of the American Revolution. And the Quakers often found themselves in kind of a uneasy position during the Revolution because they were pacifists. And so to travel to the yearly meeting down in New York City, which was like British occupied territory, if they went to Flushing, if they went to New Rochelle, somewhere in that vicinity, it often was very kind of risky for them, and they were subject to arrest sometimes. I mean, there's repeated stories during the Revolution of people who were just kind of rounded up essentially for being Quakers and being seen as kind of sympathetic to the Loyalist position, even though really they were just pacifists and they were just kind of neutral. They didn't want to have anything to do with the war. So sometimes even like the structure of Quakerism with the quarterly meetings, the yearly meetings, put them in harm's way, right, at that time. But the school was right over there, just kind of to your right. There's a historic marker around 343 that identifies the spot of it. It opened in the 1790s. And supposedly, it was the first coeducational boarding school in New York State.
It's not the United States
I think in New York State.
only.
I think in New York State, yeah. People would come from fairly distant areas to study there. The most famous student to study there was Lucretia Mott, who was a really prominent supporter of women's rights. She was at the Seneca Falls Convention in the 1840s. She was an abolitionist. So she was from Nantucket and left her home as a young girl, came here. The entire time she was here, never went home, right? Just because it was so difficult to travel at that time. It's right around 1800 or so. So spent a few years here studied about abolitionist, propaganda and stuff like that, read anti-slavery poems and was very kind of immersed in that culture. And it was interesting because at some level, Quakers, both here in this facility and at the boarding school, I mean, they were more committed to gender equality than anyone else in the country at that time, but they were less committed than we are today, right? So like, in some ways they were way ahead of everyone else, but way behind where we would want people to be. So like, this is segregated by gender, this building. The school was segregated by gender, and so there was half the school for female students, half the school for male students. The male students would have been taught by a male teacher separately from the female students who would have had a female teacher. The male teachers were paid more than the female teachers, even if they had less experience, which is something that Lucretia Mott, as a teenager, noticed and thought was unfair. But they pretty much have the same curriculum, right? So they're separated from male students, but they're pretty much learning the same stuff at a time when that really didn't ever happen. Yeah.
One thing that was interesting, like here, the Quakers out here were very active in doing away with slavery. And they went to prominent people around here and everything and did everything they could to get slaves released. And they also, the Quakers here in Millbrook were, what did I say about it? Well, I'll think of it in a minute.
Would they hide the slaves in the cellar?
They ran the Underground Railroad,
Right.
which everybody, all that stuff is in those sheets I gave you. But a lot of that is outdated, but basically all that stuff is in there.
I should say about the school, though. The school, so it opened in the 1790s. It closed in the 1860s. And then the building, which is a very large building, when the school closed, it was purchased by John Wing, who had been a student there. He had the building moved a little bit, and then it became the core of his mansion, San Donona, which is basically where the high school, middle school are today. So that was one of the largest, most prominent of these Gilded Age mansions in Millbrook. And so that whole area where the high school and middle school are, that was all his property. It was all like, terraced gardens and stuff like that. Really, really pretty. And going down, if you can picture like where Grace Church is, just above Grace Church, there's is it Millbrook Condominiums, is that what they're called?
Yes.
So that was all his property. That was all Santanona, that was all the Wing Estate. The gatehouse that's there, I think, is the original gatehouse. So the mansion doesn't exist anymore, but there's still kind of remnants of it. But the core of the mansion was originally the school building that he had moved there.
I'd like to add one more thing about the Quaker religion, which explains a lot of the equality issues and the abolitionist mentality. The Quakers believe that of God, that's the phrase, that of God resides in every human being, regardless of anything. Your abilities, your gender, your color, skin, any of it, which is why they can't accept war, because you can't kill another human being who carries within them that of God, and they can't abide oppression because of the same reason. It's kind of just fundamental.
Yeah, both oppression, but also like artificial distinctions between people in a way. So it sounds weird to us today, but one of the most noteworthy things that the Quakers did that separated them from others in the early days of the religion in the 17th and 18th centuries, they refused to use conventional pronouns to refer to people. So you almost have to like think of how Spanish works today. You know how in Spanish there's usted and there's tú, and you would use usted if you're talking to someone who is maybe unknown to you, or someone who's an adult and you're a kid, and you would use tú as a pronoun if you're kind of more familiar with them, if you're a friend. That's kind of how it was, but the fancy pronouns back then were what we think of as like very basic, like you, right? And the unfancy pronouns that they insisted on using were thee and thou, right? Those sound fancier to us today because they sound kind of archaic, but they did that with great intentionality because they thought that created less kind of artificial distinctions between people where they shouldn't exist. It's kind of interesting. And so they always sounded very different. Like you could tell someone was a Quaker, talking to them because of the language that they used.
And they also did not have priests, because that of God was with everyone. They sat and meditated in worship, as John was describing. You sat together until the Spirit might move you. You might be at a meeting and no one will say anything, but you might be at a meeting where people will feel moved to share a simple experience, like I drove up from Westchester, or they might be inclined to share that their baby died last night. So it could depend on that. And they also may share something they believe is critically important. They might refer to pacifist activities that are being gathered in the area, so that there were no priests.
And there's a tremendous amount of kind of internal social pressure within Quaker communities, and so you see that with their treatment of slavery. And so by the late 18th century, it's kind of a traditional Quaker position by that point to say, no, we should not be owning slaves. And if there are people who refuse to go along with that or refuse to emancipate their slaves, they were often kind of like drummed out of the meeting, like exiles, kind of banished from the meeting. Sometimes you would see that, like if someone who was Quaker married someone who was not Quaker, they were kind of shunned or drummed out of the meeting. And so there's a lot of like kind of internal social pressure that existed to like stick with the norms and the traditions of Quakers.
I just wanted you to pare down, I guess, from the weekly meetings to the monthly meetings to the quarterly meetings to the yearly meetings. How was the individual Quaker selected, or was there a group that went to New York? You said New York, I don't know. I would have thought Philadelphia, but to the yearly meeting. If they didn't have a hierarchy in the weekly meeting, how did they get to the yearly meeting?
It wasn't someone special. It was anyone who wanted to go could get there.
So it's open.
There still is a yearly meeting, and it's held up at Lake George.
How far did Quakerism reach? I mean, in the country, did it move westward or?
Yeah, so Philadelphia was the center of Quakerism in colonial American early republic. That's where, Pennsylvania was founded as a haven and as a refuge for Quakers who were being persecuted back in England by William Penn. Dutchess County had the second largest number of Quakers after Philadelphia at that time. I kind of like to think of it, Quakers, because they were different from mainline Protestants, were often persecuted, not just in England, but in this country as well. There's evidence of that throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. And so they often try to go to places where they could be kind of separate and distinct and, you know, cut themselves off from these other contexts. And so a lot of the places that were important centers of Quaker life are actually places today where, like, rich people have second homes. Like Bear Island at the end of Long Island, Nantucket, right? These are all important centers of Quaker activity in the 18th century because they were isolated places, and that's what people still value today in these places. That they're a little. Now they don't all end up like that. Like Flushing is obviously not like that anymore, but a lot of them are like that.
There were Quakers in Ohio too, and in Indiana.
I was going to say, I know they were in Ohio. I've seen them out in Ohio. So,
Yeah, right
Columbus.
on the border.
And you also have them up in Chatham, New York.
Yeah, that's where the Quaker Retreat Center is.
Oh yeah, all over. Yeah, I mean, it wasn't an exhaustive list.
They were basically farmers, so I believe.
No, they did everything. They did everything.
So they,
Swords,
but I think that was basically agricultural.
Well, I live in a Quaker colonial house, and it mirrors another house two Quaker men built at the same time and helped each other. And the site was 1750. I've done all the research, and it's the Quaker colonial architecture, which is separate from the Protestant colonial architecture, is in the book. Oh my God, the title is Albion Seed. And you can see the design of the Quaker colonial houses. It's very simple. It runs on, if you know art history, it runs on the concept of the Bauhaus movement, its form and function. There's nothing that's wasted in the construction of the house. And it's basically, you open the front door, which opens you on the south side, you open the door and the staircase is in your face. And the dining room is on the left, and the living room is on the right. And then there's a small kitchen, much more modest than the colonial kitchens in the back, which is the north side. And when you go upstairs, of course, there's no internal bathroom or plumbing. You go up to the second floor, and it's 3 rooms on the first floor, and it's 4 rooms on the second floor, and all the bedrooms are in the corners. And then, of course, there is an outhouse outside. And you can find that design in wood, stone. I guess that's it, wood and stone.
What's it called?
So it's all very functional.
Yeah.
Everything had a function.
Getting back to the building here.
She's
The outside walls are 34 inches thick. And that plaster was made out of horsehair and mud.
That's right.
And that's lasted since 1780. We have a couple cracks here and there, but other than that, it has held up here all those years.
Same with the schoolhouse.
And I'm not sure, people's appetite for hearing all this stuff, I want to try people's patience, but I think a lot of you probably know this, but if we just want to visualize what this area was like in 1780 when this building was built, right? So there's no Millbrook, right? Like the village of Millbrook does not exist in any form, that's just farm, right? Where Franklin Ave is and all that. There's really 2 hamlets, right? One is right where we are right now, which is called Mechanic, right? And it's hard to imagine this because this seems so rural, but this was a little kind of center of community life. There were stores, there were a bunch of houses kind of close to each other, right here. And then about, less than a mile that way, there was Hart's Village, right? So there's still Hart's Village Road. That's where I live. The house was from 1760, so it was here when this was built. And that was another little center of activity where there was a store and a bunch of houses gathered together. That was basically where people wanted to make money because there was the Wappingers Creek, right? And so there were mills that were built there. And so that was kind of the commercial center of this area. And this was settled in the 1730s and 1740s by Quakers, right? Who had to make money, of course, and were farming and had a store, but came here for a very different reason. And so like, I like to think of this as like a little kind of microcosm of 17th century colonial America. Maybe you guys like learned in school about there was Jamestown, right, in 1607, and those people who settled Jamestown, they were trying to make money, right? That was part of the Virginia Company. They were going to grow tobacco, they were going to make money. And then there were people who came to Plymouth, right, and settled there for religious reasons. And so basically what we have here in this, mile apart from each other, just kind of a microcosm. People coming in the early 18th century to make money, mills, people coming to practice their religion freely, just kind of, writ small.
What about the indigenous people?
Yeah, so there were, Allison, yeah, there were definitely indigenous people here. It's hard to pin that down, exactly where they lived. Possible that they could have lived around like where Washington Hollow is today by the Taconic. But
I think it was a crossroads here, and there were, maybe as I understand, more concentrated points over near Kent, or wherever possibly the leader of that tribe found good land, and they wanted to settle, like down in Dover Plains, I guess at one point they came over and said, oh, this is good, let's stay. And that also melded into over by the river, and the Wappingers and the Rampe, and then the Mohican more north. And it was sort of as I understand, a mix through here, the crossroads, but there was certainly that life here. And we have much more to learn about it.
If you want to come into the other section over here, it's completely different. And those benches in there are full of kids, carved their initials in there.
And some of them right over there.
Yeah. Whole bunch of them right here.
We live in the Shingle House, 2 blocks from here, which was, it was the fire manager's house.
So there's a house like right here.
Which was
That's the care I've that house. Yeah, that was part of it.
And there were the ones right here. Yeah. So it was, yeah, the
Old Gilded Age houses with so many outbuildings, and sometimes that's what survives, you know?
Yeah.
Because no one can afford to have the giant mansion, so. No.
So yeah, we found a fish and like all sorts of like papers from like, cows and stuff.
Yeah, it's beautiful stuff. It's all around. Yeah, it's really neat.
Think of the historical society.
It's all like, nothing's like in great shape, but we have a lot.
We have farms, you get to say all the names that goes on.
But yeah, the farm itself is kind of but we're still dead.
There's still an old behind these houses up there. That is like sort of
Yeah, it's not like explain if they're trying to figure out the exact footprint of San Donata. It's
yeah. They used to go down to the farm and be a lot of stuff.
Yeah. I know.
I don't think that's intentional. Ask John if you can buy some of these stuff at the
I
end.
will. I might just quietly slide him $20.
Yeah.
Now he's trying to say.
Just in the past.
Like I said, you got to keep in mind, this thing goes back to 1780. And there's never been heat, there's never been electric in here. And the only thing that keeps always breathing.
The airspace.
Yeah, for the airspace. Anybody, if you got a question or anything or you want to say, that's what we're here for.
I'll just say, a couple years ago, Ken Burns made a documentary about Ben Franklin. I don't know if anybody saw that. It was pretty good. And they came here, and John can talk more about this maybe, to film in this spot. And it had nothing to do with Millbrook or this specific meeting house, but they were just using this as kind of a stand-in for a Quaker meeting house in Philadelphia in the 18th century. And they came, and I don't know, did they spend the whole day here?
They spent the whole day here,
And it was about 8 seconds, if that. It looked great. It looked beautifully shot and everything, but
they had a young girl about 20 or 22 was in all the photos. She'd be standing by the window and they'd shoot her from the side and the top, and they'd shoot her from up there. But she had
Historically dressed, John?
She had tattoos from her ear to her toe.
Oh, no. That's not in the final film, so I don't know who she was.
I never did get to see the final
That was an
film.
outside shot. What did
I would like to know how they used, I'm going to call them windows between the two rooms. How did they're so dramatic. How did they decide when to lift and raise those windows?
Depending on what they were talking about. If the men, it was business, it was the men only. If it involved everybody, then they would lift them.
I see. So it was it was democratic. If it involved everyone, they lifted them. If it was just for finances and men, it was closed.
Yeah. And like I said, it holds at least another 500 people upstairs in the balcony.
Must have been toasty warm then.
And then the history kind of beyond 1780. In the early 19th century, there was a big split within the Quaker community. There was a prominent Quaker leader named Elias Hicks. And some people kind of followed him, and some people stayed kind of orthodox. And so at one point in the 19th century, it got so intense, this split, that there was this Quaker meeting house, and then there was a separate Quaker meeting house built like, I think right over here. You can see it on some maps. And then, of course, the Quaker community kind of dwindled here over the course of the 19th century. And then when the Federated Church, Lisle, opened, that kind of incorporated the surviving Quakers in the community, and this was more, I mean, not completely closed, obviously it's still used today, but they didn't have the congregation, really didn't have the group to support this anymore.
If you look through that window over there, you can see a lot of windows that were blown. And periodically a tree or a bird hits it. When we place them, we just put in, regular glass.
John, I have a question about how you get upstairs. We're assuming in the corner, is that the staircase?
That's the staircase.
So there's an entry outside?
Is it what?
Yeah, right from the hallway. There's two on either end. There's stairs that go up.
Mr. Flanagan, who cleans the place? I remember as a youth group.
Right there, the superintendent of the...
When we were in youth group, we used to come here and clean the whole place before the Quakers had their annual meeting or whatever it was.
I was going to come over with Bob and do it, and I got over here, and this Bob already had everything vacuumed. It doesn't get dirty because nobody's going in and out,
Right.
but bats can make an awful mess.
Right there, okay.
Spiders, that means all spiders and all the windows.
There's no attic, is there? Is that the
Yes, there is.
Yeah.
An attic? There
You
is.
stand over where she is, looks good up that way.
So there's an airspace above and an airspace below.
Yeah.
That's the reason it says even.
But the guy who did a lot of the work on the roof and on the windows and that, he finally said that was too high for him, he wasn't doing it anymore. So we don't bother with it.
So who is it owned by now? Who is it owned by?
This right first they gave it to the Lyle Federated Church, they had about 4 Quakers up there. And then eventually they gave it back to us because they had no money. Now, oh God, about a dozen years ago, they put a whole new roof on this place.
Yeah.
Because the roof was gone.
So who pays for that then?
We paid for it.
When there's an attorney, goes to the works for contractors and help them fixing things in these better break. And just recently, we got a grant to help with the asphalt. Right, it was wonderful.
Yeah, it's great. In the next few years, you'll be hearing more about it though, because there is going to be an effort to try to get a maintenance fund together.
Right.
Partners
That makes
Quaker
sense.
House, yeah.
People aren't dying often enough to pay for the place.
By the way, there are grave lots for sale. Anybody who wants one, it's open to the public.
How much are they?
What do they cost now?
10 foot by 40 inches is $2,900, and that includes land, permanent maintenance, and the corner markers.
Up until last January, it was 1,900 a grade. But St. Joseph's
1,900 a grade?
a grade. And that's 40 inches wide by 10 feet. But
Does
St.
it have to be a
Joseph,
bottle? A bottle. Does it have to be a body, or can you be cremated in?
you can put three urns in the grave.
So the Quakers say it's okay to be cremated?
This isn't dictated by the Quakers.
Oh, okay.
This is overseen by the cemetery.
Most of the people buried here are not Quaker.
Not Quakers. So,
But do
Just
Quakers
the early
believe that you can be cremated?
yes.
Oh, yeah.
Because the Bible is against it.
Now, they're supposed to use drones where the cars are parked out here and get pictures underground. We want to see if they're, you know.
Oh,
We only know what we were told and what's in our history, that a lot of Quakers were buried on that hill. So,
Who might be doing that? Is it contracted? With use of the drones
what do you call it?
We actually see it through the department, we have these drones here on the radar, and that's pretty expensive. And I forgot.
Gee, what's his name?
Oh, I asked the guy in town if I could borrow his.
Well, I'm wondering if there's a student group, a college bar.
Well, Vassar did that in the Greenbrier Cemetery off Oak Summit, and around 2002, they found more graves than they thought they had. It costs $250 a day to rent one of these machines, or buy one for $30,000, or rent it for $1,000 a week, or $2,000 a month. So you have to really know what your need is. And
I wonder if there's a academic interest.
oh yeah,
nearby
that's great.
places.
I'd love to know what's under really.
Yeah, that would be really.
Did the guy in the back have a question?
Yeah, so this building then isn't protected by any historical designation? It's just strictly owned by 9 partners, or does it have some type of protected status?
No, it's owned by the cemetery. Nine Partners Cemetery is a non-profit group that runs everything here. But what's hurting now, people are not doing casket and vault burials. All we're getting is an urn buried for $800. The guy who mows the lawn here alone gets $32,000. And that includes the trimming and the mowing. And anything else he does, he charges extra for it. And there's just no income coming in.
Seems to me that if maybe the Historical Society had also access, maybe we could have some kind of fundraiser.
We will, I mean,
Right?
we will. Yeah, I mean, it should be a joint effort.
The Historical Society is not exactly a cash rich institution. We're rich in material culture.
sanctimonious, I mean, this is.
Another strange thing in this cemetery, for years and years and years, they let people, oh, I want to be under that oak tree. and they'd sell them a stone or 2 or 3 plots, and they want to be up on that hill, and a lot of people wanted to see the golf course. You can't believe how many people told us that they'd like that, be able, like they're gonna see it, you know? And they staggered stuff all over the place. It's only like the last 15, 20 years, way over on the end, it's called the D section here, where they're in line, all lined
Long
up.
division reigns there.
But we have big areas up here now that if we ever do get a guy up here to map this, we don't know what's in a lot of places. But they just let people pick where they want it to be, and you can't do that.
And for a long time, they wouldn't let black people be buried.
Right.
Are there any black people?
That's a good transition, because I'm going to put in a plug for our next program, which is September 21st. It's back to our regular schedule, so it's at the library, Thursday night, September 21st. And it is all about this collection that we got donated last summer. All this material from a black family that lived in Millbrook for a long time, at least for part of it on Harts Village Road. And almost everybody that I'm going to talk about in that presentation is buried here. Now, there was kind of like a de facto segregation, I guess, that existed within the cemetery, because all the black families are buried kind of very close in the front of the cemetery, kind of close to the to Church Street, but they're all there. So when I talk, I'll
50 feet out the back door.
There's Charlie Johnson, yeah, that's a little later,
There's
yeah.
at least 25 black people, so they were not discriminated on. You can't do that. Even in those days, you couldn't do it. But as you do come in off of Church Street, there's a whole string, maybe, what, 15?
Actually, there's 2 graves that are like maybe right in the front, the first ones you can see from Church Street, of people who fought in the colored regiments during the Civil War.
Yeah.
That are there, yeah.
And there's quite over on the other side, the D section, there's quite a few over there too.
So September 21st. We have cookies, we have brownies outside underneath the tree over there.
And water to sip.
Yeah. If people have more questions for John or anybody, feel free to ask, but we can wander out there and have a little snack. Thanks for coming.
Don't forget, you can buy a cemetery plot.
$10,000.
Thank you.